you very much for coming. This is from Oshawa to Ottawa. Take the plant, save the planet. My name is Paul Gray, and I'm going to be chairing the meeting tonight, and I'll be facilitating the discussion afterwards. I'd like to begin with land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which we are meeting is in the dish with one spoon territory and is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'd like to thank the sponsors of tonight's event, including Green Jobs Oshawa, who you're going to hear more about, the Socialist Project, and LEAP. So this is a time of challenges, but also a time of some optimism. We're a few days removed from the global climate strikes, and while I'm sure many of you have heard of the closure of the General Motors plant in Oshawa, I think that there are activities going on there that represent the kind of green worker alliance that is necessary to address the climate crisis that besets us. A group of workers have created a movement in Oshawa called Green Jobs Oshawa, and we have two of them here tonight. They are going to speak to you about that. One of the things we're going to talk about is a recent feasibility study that determined the plant could be converted into the production of more environmentally sustainable technologies, electric vehicles, light mass transit, and the like. And this, I think, is the kind of strategy that we need to be moving towards. Things like energy conversion and retrofitting are obviously important, but in order to meet the climate crisis, we need a massive transformation of our economies and our societies. It's going to require things like public ownership, genuine democratic ownership, people determining the future of this society by having a say in the planning of this kind of green transition. And this set of ideas has been expressed, given a number of names. You may have heard of it in terms of a just transition. You may have heard of proposals for a Green New Deal. And these, I think, are the kind of ambitious proposals that we need to address a crisis of the labor movement. This provides an opportunity for union renewal, labor movement renewal, to collaborate in a meaningful way with the environmental movement, which has undertaken incredibly impressive activities, in some cases heroic, but nevertheless has been scattered, and really a collaboration between the labor movements and the environmental movements, I think, is necessary to meet the climate crisis. And so it's in that spirit that I'm really excited for tonight's event and for the speakers at tonight's event. And so we're going to have each of the folks up here speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. And the first person that I would like to introduce to you is Giovanna Riccio. She's a Toronto-based, internationally recognized poet. She's written a poem just for this event. And she also has a new book, Plastics Republic, from Guernica Editions. And so I invite Giovanna to give us her poem.
Hi, everybody. I'm here to bring greetings from my partner, George Elliott Clark, former Toronto Poet Laureate, National Poet Laureate, who wanted to be here and also to share a poem with you. However, he's away for the weekend and couldn't quite get out. So I've written a poem here. I just finished it today. It was short notice, and it's called Electrified Air, but I was quibbling with that title. Maybe it's called Plant and Planet. You can title it if you like. My lungs ache, my chest tightens when I remember the robin's grounded wings, the mangled contract. How Fossil fuel tycoons every day got away with murder. And smug GM execs snug in private planes jetted through workaday rainbows, incinerating 4 generations of auto workers, all the while emitting do-gooder airs, poor-mouthing as secretly they idled the clock. Mum about concessions and 2-tiered wages. Assembly lines rear-ended as they piled up dinero. Tight-lipped about in cahoots politicians or billions in forgiven loans. Mum about GM on the dole, pocketing bailouts as backhanded subsidies. Corporate bums riding free on the taxpayer's dime. Then they crash the books, so numbers combust to a scorched earth policy. And Mary Barra, cushy in the company's stretch limo hearse, singing a geopolitical dirge for Oshawa, hitching our unallocated plant to a no rules playbook, steering our daily bread south to another maquiladora, spewing cars and trucks that line GM's pockets by bleeding and beggaring Mexican workers. And far from gulls smothered in black gold, oil baron Molochs brew barrels of ecocide, blind to babes bartered to Exxon and the Koch brothers, deaf to teens exhausted by the internal combustion engine, choking on tomorrow going up in smoke. Brave and wild the young, who eye the maple leaf rusting against the polar ice cap smelt, while bearing witness to Atlantic right whales' battered majesty sacrificed to drunken cruise ships and dollar store freight carriers, waving in climate refugees disgorged by oceans rising red in bloody protest. Too young are they for hope to be flattened by hurricanes, cutting class each Friday, pulling the government's ear closer to the truth. Too grieved and green, they stare down the UN's averted shame, its back to a future snuffed by the ever-thin promise of permanent jobs flowing from trickle-down economics through pipelines into the shareholders' insatiable maw. Their two worldly guardians hold hostage this planet and fritter away their every night stars. No surprise then that Oshawa goes dark when a kingpin father fuses dream to nightmare, torpedoes the child next door. If parents love their progeny, they must keep house, be one with earth. Figure that one's a number that grows on itself, person to person, summons unity, sums pushback and power, growing a union. And one means vanguard Greta, a voice to rally a once silent choir, singing now a singular anthem. A harmony of aqua sea, yellow sun garbing justice in Amazon green. Nature's indigenous union, leading, seeding the streets with emerald citizens, cutting a clearing through carbonized air. And one means no to orderly wind down. Go Oshawa Greens to keep on the lights. Workers power up a unity spark. Spark citizens to charge a fossilized city. Visionaries, they electrify GM's shuttered heart. Too much for business. Status quo sharks sound greenback panic. Best retrain folks to buy capital spin. But profits contend. A PM who billions a soul fracking pipeline can pony up bullion, squeeze carbon, let shine the people's unbreakable diamond hard light.
Okay, great. That was really fantastic. Thank you very much. And I know it looks like our projector is malfunctioning. I assure you this is totally intentional. This is a visual representation of rising sea levels. We planned this the entire time. Okay, I am really happy to introduce next Tony Leah and Rebecca Keetch. Tony Leah is a machine welder at GM Oshawa, and Rebecca Keetch has been a quote-unquote temporary worker for over 8 years, which gives you an indication of the nature of our economy. Both are founding members of Green Jobs Oshawa, and I encourage you to check out greenjobsoshawa.ca and sign their online petition. That's greenjobsoshawa.ca. Please check out the online petition. I turn it over now to Tony and Rebecca.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. Sisters and brothers, comrades, I'm really pleased to be here with a group of unionists who believe that it's time for the labor movement to go on the offensive instead of being on the defensive and fight for real gains for workers. I know you're there, and hopefully that's what's happening in the United States right now with the UAW strike. It's great to be at a meeting with environmental activists who no longer accept business as usual and demand action to halt the unrestricted burning of fossil fuels. And it's wonderful to be with socialists who understand that both of those objectives require us to break the stranglehold that capital has on our economic and political life. And one of those corporations which has exercised tremendous power over us to our detriment is General Motors Corporation, of course. And when GM announced last November that they were closing 5 plants across North America, including Oshawa, at tremendous cost to the workers and to our communities, we had to struggle with how we were going to confront them, how we were going to challenge them. And our union conducted a campaign which ended up with a rather disappointing result. Of the 5,000 direct jobs involved with vehicle production in Oshawa, there's a settlement that will provide jobs for 300 people in Oshawa doing aftermarket parts. So it means that we have to think broader. We have been challenged in Oshawa to expand our horizons, to break out of the mindset that everything has to be dependent on corporations. We have to get rid of the idea that if we want to build vehicles, that we have to have a corporation in charge, that we have to have corporations in charge of everything. That's an idea that is wrong. It's blatantly, obviously wrong. We don't want corporations running our healthcare. We don't need corporations running anything because they act for their owners, not for us, not in the public interest. And so that was the reason that we undertook a campaign in Oshawa amongst workers at the plant, the supplier workers, for other companies whose jobs depend on vehicle production in Oshawa, on behalf of the community, in alliance with the Durham Region Labor Council, other unions, community members, to challenge this idea that things have to be done by corporations. And we advanced the idea that we could build vehicles in Oshawa, provide good jobs for workers, for the future, for our families and children and grandchildren, and for the community, that instead of building vehicles which are being built so they can make a profit for somebody, we could change to building the vehicles that we need for the future, which has to be zero emission vehicles, electric vehicles, and that have to be pitched towards public transit and the needs of all levels of our government and our communities. And that the way to do that is to challenge our governments to intervene, not allow the jobs to be taken away. If GM is going to leave that plant, then we should own that plant. Really, we already paid for that. Canadians gave GM almost $11 billion in 2009, which they used for their benefit, not for our benefit. They have made profits, astronomical profits, every year since then. In addition to that, they forced workers to give concessions and take lower wages. They forced us to accept that workers being hired would start at 40% less than the wage of workers who were there before. And people like Rebecca end up working for 13 years now at more than $10 an hour below what other workers in the plant are making. These are horrible sacrifices that GM has benefited from, GM has profited from. No increases for our retirees since 2007, which means they have lost 20% of the purchasing power of their pensions. So we have paid, and therefore we should own. And that's what we have been arguing. But to put some flesh on those bones, we arranged for a feasibility study to be conducted. And it's quite detailed. I think that there's copies of the summary on one of the tables at the back. The full 69-page study is available on our website, and I encourage everybody to read it. It's a great read, and there's lots of terrific examples in it. But it also sets out clearly what could be done. And that's what we need, is to be thinking about what could be done. What could we do if we get out of that box of thinking that everything has to be run by corporations? The feasibility study was done by Russ Christensen, a consultant who also works for the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation. And Russ's study was based on what he calls a triple bottom line. So not just the normal bottom line that we're used to hearing about corporations talking about their profits, but looking at the economic feasibility, the social gains, and the environmental gains that could come out of how we could organize production. On the economic side of it, Russ's study showed that we could have a facility building electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, starting with supplying vehicles for government departments. Start with Canada Post,
Yes.
which has 13,000 vehicles in their fleet. Electrify those and have those electric vans and vehicles built in Oshawa. Look at other government departments, federal, provincial, municipal. Look at the whole range of government procurement. And Russ's study goes through the number of vehicles that would be involved and how many vehicles we could build. And that would be the anchor of starting up a plant in Oshawa under public ownership to meet public needs. His study, using very modest assumptions, nothing outlandish, standard economic measures, showed that that facility would grow, would be reach a break-even point in the 4th year, and would be turning a modest profit in the 5th year. So on the economic side of it, it is doable. The investment that's required is reasonable, and the returns are great. On the environmental side, the second leg of the triple bottom line, Russ's study shows that the vehicles assembled over 5 years would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in Canada by 400,000 metric tons of CO2. So that would be a significant contribution, and it is what governments need to be doing now. That's one of the fundamental things they need to be doing, is starting with their own fleets and not burning any more fossil fuel. On the social side, of course, the benefits center around providing jobs for workers and for the community. Russ's study shows that at the end of a 5-year period, there would be the creation of about 2,900 jobs, mostly in manufacturing and in-house part production. And he based his study on those jobs being paid at the current top rate for assemblers in Oshawa of about $35 an hour, and with a cost of living increase every year. And that in itself is would be a fantastic step forward, because instead of always talking about how much we're going to give up and how much we're going to have taken away from us, and we haven't had a cost of living in Oshawa since 2007, now we would have a cost of living and a decent wage for everybody, and get rid of this two-tier system, and it could be done, and it's feasible. That's amazing. Get rid of this horseshit about, workers have to take less. We don't have to take less in order for things to be done. Including the multiplier jobs, it would be modestly at least 13,000 jobs in the community, which is very important, and they would be good paying jobs with decent benefits. There would be community involvement. Paul mentioned talked about democratic public ownership, and the model needs to be based on our communities and our governments and us as working people having a say in how things are being done. And so one of the great social benefits of this project in Oshawa would be the example that it would set for other communities in this country for a different way of doing things. And instead of us as workers competing or thinking that workers in Mexico are the problem, this would be a model that would facilitate, encourage international cooperation, because it would be a model that could be taken up by workers who are fighting against GM and other corporations like that in Canada, in the United States, in Mexico, all around the world. On the cost side of the study, again using very modest standard economic assumptions, Russ's feasibility study projects a cost to the Canadian government to acquire the facility and operate it and retool it for electric vehicles of between $1.4 and $1.9 billion. A modest cost compared to the incredible benefits, really, that we can see coming out of it. And compare that to the cost of the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is almost 3 times that. $4.5 billion to acquire the existing pipeline, another $10 billion to expand it so that it will triple the amount of bitumen being taken out of Alberta and being sent across the ocean to be refined and then burned, which is a huge negative cost to our planet, to us. Instead of that, this would be a much more modest cost, much more positive benefit. Or compare it to the bailout of GM and Chrysler in 2009 of $13.7 billion, which we now see has only benefited the corporation's owners, not us, not our communities. Or compare it to the cut in the corporate tax rate. From 2006 to 2011, corporate tax rates in Canada were reduced from 22% to 15%. That is a cost to all of us, because that's money that our government doesn't have anymore to spend for socially necessary things. That is a cost to all of us of $12 billion every year. So if you look at those costs, what's being projected for electric vehicle production in Oshawa under public ownership would be much more modest. And of course, that's not even including the argument, which we need to make politically, that a government worth its salt, a government with any backbone, would let General Motors know, we have already paid for that and we don't need to pay for it again. One of the great things about the campaign that we've been waging since April in Oshawa, and thank you for your wonderful support here as part of it, is I think that we're starting to change the discourse. We're starting to get people to ask questions that needed to be asked about how we should run our society and what role public ownership should play in it. And there's people on this table who have contributed tremendously to that as well. And that's important. That's incredibly important. And I want to end with an example of that, and it's a headline that appeared in the Toronto Star on September 21st in a story by Jennifer Wells, based on the work that we've been doing. And she asked the question, and I will ask you the question in this headline. Would it be crazy to nationalize the Oshawa General Motors plant and use it to make electric vehicles for Canada Post? Would it be crazy? It would be crazy not to.
Thank you, Tony. So, as he's talked about, we are here tonight to talk about what is possible. Is battery electric vehicle production in Oshawa possible? Is government investment and public ownership in Oshawa possible? Is maintaining the productive capacity of the Oshawa Assembly Plant possible? Is building a new way of thinking that prioritizes the environment, the community, and the citizens of our country over corporate greed possible? And the answer to all of these questions is yes. However, it is only possible if we start having a bigger conversation around what it will actually take to address the climate crisis, rising inequality, and increasingly precarious work. We need to have a conversation about the fact that profit-driven corporations are not going to put public need ahead of their own bottom line. They never have, and they never will. The announcement by GM in November of 2018, at a time of record profits, to close the Oshawa Assembly Plant along with 4 other plants in the States, sent feelings of hurt, anger, and betrayal through communities across North America. These announcements should make all of us furious, whether we are auto workers or not. Approximately 10 years ago, Canadians invested in GM. The Canadian government bailed out GM with billions of dollars. Our government invested in GM because it knew the value of good-paying manufacturing jobs. The workers have also invested by giving massive concessions to keep automobile production in Canada. The public has invested by buying GM products and supporting their record profits. What did GM give us in return? After returning to profitability and making billions of dollars in obscene profits year after year, GM announced the closure of the Oshawa plant, the loss of literally thousands of jobs, and devastation to families throughout our community. This is what corporate greed gets us, and our community and provinces deserve better. So what is the solution? Many have heard about a Green New Deal, a policy framework that tackles the environmental crisis, rising inequality, and precarious work. It calls for massive government investment to move to a green new economy, but it also makes workers and communities central in this transition. A Green New Deal calls for good jobs to be created and just transition planning so that workers and communities thrive as we move to a green new economy, instead of getting left behind. We need to invest in a Green New Deal. What would it take to make Oshawa the center of a Green New Deal? to move away from theoretical discussions to a concrete example of what can be done. It takes political will. It takes changing the conversation and thinking bigger than we ever have before. It takes demanding climate action and economic justice. As Tony has just talked about, in the September 2019 Feasibility Study released by Russ Christensen confirms, electric vehicle production, anchored by government procurement needs in Oshawa, is possible. Are we willing to think big enough, to dream big enough, to make public ownership, democratic planning for the environment, and green vehicle production a reality in Oshawa? We need to address the climate crisis. We need good jobs to fight inequality and precarity. We have a plant, we have a skilled workforce, and we have a big idea. All we need is a political will and to not be afraid of thinking big. I know it's been mentioned a couple of times before, but we have a petition on our website at greenjobsoshawa.ca, and it is really important, if you support this idea at all, that you share this petition, that you sign it, and that you encourage others to as well. If you're on Facebook, you could also go to our Facebook page, the Green Jobs Oshawa, and give us a like and follow. We'd appreciate that as well. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you very much. That was great. Our next speaker is Linda McQuaig. She's an award-winning journalist and author, and she has a new book, The Sport and Prey of Capitalists: How the Rich Are Stealing Canada's Public Wealth. And there are copies available for sale here tonight. Give a round of applause.
And thank you, Paul, for those kind words. You know, it's terrific to be part of this esteemed panel with such a great group of activists, and to be talking about such a terrific idea. I mean, as David DePoe was saying just before the meeting, you know, we got here, nationalization, green energy, thousands of jobs, like this is a no-brainer, right? It's fantastic. The only kind of curious thing is why it's totally absent from the national agenda, including in the middle of a federal election. You know, and one of the questions is, where is the NDP? But of course, it's the Trudeau government that's actually in power, so I will direct most of my ire against them. I mean, one of Trudeau's key messages has always been, you know, we can have economic growth and we can fight climate change. You know, and by that he means we can build the Trans Mountain Pipeline, expand the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and fight climate change. And that, as you know, many sensible commentators have pointed out, is simply bullshit. You know, that just can't happen. Because the Trans Mountain Pipeline, of course, as Tony was explaining, triples the production of oil coming from the oil sands, and that's one of the dirtiest oils on the planet. As James Hansen, the climate scientist, has said, you develop the whole of the oil sands and that's game over for the planet. But you know, in an interesting way, even though what Trudeau says we can have this economic growth and climate change, fight climate change, that's bullshit in the way he presents it. There is another way that you actually could do this, where you could have economic growth and you could fight climate change, but that involves a new economic model. That involves a model that would include and be focused on transitioning to a new green economy. And let's face it, that's the direction the world is headed in. You know, an electric vehicle revolution is very much in the future. In fact, there's a recent IMF study that shows that, or that predicts that within 20 years, 90% of the cars produced in the world will be electric. And I mean, that just sounds hard to grasp, hard to believe, right? But, you know, back in 1910, it would have been hard to believe that, you know, they were on the cusp of moving from the horse and buggy to the car. But in 1910, I think that the Model T Ford had just basically come out and people were all excited about it. But they realized, you know, this car is so expensive, and it was very expensive. There's no way ordinary people could afford that. But what ended up happening was, over the next dozen years, the price of that Model T Ford just kept coming down. It ended up coming down about 70%. And by then, they were selling 2 million of those Fords a year. And that IMF study that I mentioned points out that, in fact, the transition to electric vehicles could well take place even faster than that transition from horse and buggies to cars, which took place in about 12 years. And in fact, in many parts of the world, it's already happening, particularly in Europe and China. An interesting example is what's happening in Germany. Germany takes climate change much more seriously than we do. And among other things, their new regulations push their post office, the publicly owned post office, to realize they had to go to electric vehicles for delivery. And they couldn't find a suitable private sector company to do it. So what they do, they found a startup and they took it over, they nationalized it. And they started producing electric vans for the post office that way. And that was only a few years ago. It's been so successful. They're now about to enter into a joint venture with a company to produce similar vehicles in China. So that is kind of strikes me as an interesting model for Canada when we're talking about, you know, producing, you know, vehicles for the post office or for hydro or for school buses, whatever. But the crucial ingredient in all this, the crucial ingredient to move this plan forward, is some kind of government involvement, some kind of government leadership, which of course we're seeing very little of. It's interesting that we have this, in fact, long, impressive history in public enterprise in this country. You know, the United States is a kind of country that's distinguished itself for good and for bad as a private enterprise country. But Canada, we haven't done so well in private enterprise, but we've kind of excelled at public enterprise, at power plants, Ontario Hydro, the CNR, Connaught Labs, etc. And so that is a really impressive tradition, and it particularly took off during wartime, because in wartime we recognized that, you know, fighting the enemy is such an important imperative, and there's so much mobilization required to get the industrial effort going that you can't just leave that to the private sector. You can't trust them to deliver because, you know, they're too concerned with profit motives. If it's not profitable, they won't do it. So in wartime, in the Second World War in Canada, the government took over the effort, and the government created, the Canadian government actually created 28 crown corporations that produced this magnificent war effort. And they also nationalized, temporarily took over the auto companies and converted them to military production. So it's incredible, in fact, what the government is capable of doing when it wants to do. And the point is, as Tony was saying, that kind of massive mobilization is exactly what's needed now to create some kind of Green New Deal. I mean, the enemy we face today, climate change, in a different sort of way is just as threatening to us as the German army was during the Second World War. So the fascinating question becomes, given the excellence of this idea, why is it so much not on the political agenda? I mean, even if you look at, let's say, the business case between, as Tony was alluding to this earlier, the business case between Trudeau's investment in Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. Once that expansion is complete, it will have involved in the neighborhood of $12 billion of Canadian taxpayer money. To what end? To create, well, first of all, very few jobs, very few permanent jobs. There'll be some construction jobs in the short term. And to facilitate this climate-destroying oil sands to be further developed. It's just an absolute no-brainer, really bad idea. And interestingly enough, it hasn't even won Trudeau any support in Alberta. But compare that with this idea for GM jobs in Oshawa. I mean, first of all, as Tony was saying, the feasibility study shows thousands of full-time permanent jobs could be created, and for a very good purpose, to produce electric vehicles, and for a fraction of the cost, $1.9 billion, which is about 1/10 of the cost of that Trans Mountain investment. And furthermore, also as Tony points out, even that overstates the cost, because hell, we should expropriate the thing. We invested $11 billion in the bailout. They didn't pay back $3 billion of that. So they pretty much owe us a plan, really. So you know, Trudeau's reluctance to support this in any way, you know, it really comes down to Liberals being too close to business, and you know, having bought into that argument we hear all the time, the private sector does things better, the private sector is always doing things better, and an idea like this is too ambitious for the public sector. I mean, I would argue that in fact the very ambitiousness of this project, the very importance of it, cries out for the public sector. You know, we've been so brainwashed by privatization in recent years. You know, privatization has become the kind of dogma of our times, even though there's no evidence of the benefits. And I would argue it's time that we reject that obsession with privatization. It's time, more urgently than ever now because of the climate emergency, that we not only stop shrinking the public sector, but actually start expanding the public sector. And this GM Oshawa idea could be the first step in that Green New Deal. It could be perhaps the first of 28 great crown corporations we could create to further climate change. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I mentioned Linda's book, which there are copies here, and Giovanna's book. Should also say that we have a literature table at the back, so after the event, a bunch of the sponsoring groups and folks who are here tonight have pamphlets and books and things available at that back table, so I encourage you to check it out.
And the feasibility studies here.
Okay, great. Yep. Okay, our next speaker is James Hutt. He's the lead organizer with LEAP. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you. I'm really honored to be up here sharing a stage with all these brilliant speakers and learning from them, and I'm excited to be putting this into motion with all of you. I think for me, I just want to start by recognizing this incredible and really monumental thing that happened on the weekend, right? All around the world, and here in Canada, on Friday, we had 80 different cities and towns in which people took to the streets. In Montreal, we had 500,000 people. In Toronto, we had 40,000. And in Vancouver, we had 100,000 people coming out to demand system change, not climate change. my hat is off to the organizers in each and every city, big or small, and I think it really shows that the tide of public opinion is changing. And people, especially young people, are rejecting leaders who urge calm in the face of a crisis, because we are in a crisis. And young people especially are out in the streets demanding a Green New Deal. And Rebecca talked a little bit about what it is, but it is a full framework to really transform society. It's not a plan, but a framework to tackle the two biggest crises of our time: climate change and inequality. Massive public investments to transform society for the better public good, to an equitable, more equal economy. So everything from investments in housing and affordable housing and housing co-ops to expanded public transit that's improved and free. And also, of course, investments in green energy. And the really big part is a good job guarantee, so that everyone can have a good unionized job that's low carbon and contributes to a better society. Now, I'm always curious to get a reading of the room, so if folks will indulge me, I'm just curious if you can put up your hand if you're in a union local, or if you're in a union. Cool. And thank you. Can you put up your hand if you are a climate activist or part of an environmental organization? Interesting. And can you put up your hand if you'd heard of a Green New Deal before today? I'm guessing this is not a typical crowd. And that's great to see. And I think this is really front and center for what we're talking about, because this is what's going on in Oshawa right now. GM workers there are proposing to build the very engine for a Green New Deal in Canada right now. And for me, I think it is the single most important fight that's going on in the country, both in climate and in labor, because it is the building blocks for the world that we want to create. Now, last winter, when GM announced that they were closing the plant, and they announced this on the 100th anniversary of GM in Oshawa, after 100 years, they announced that they were laying off 15,000 workers, 5,000 direct jobs at the plant, 10,000 indirect, some across Ontario. And it's devastating news for workers and families. But it was a result of a decades-long attack on workers, supported by governments, bleeding them for more and more profit, while forcing them to work longer hours, facing more injuries, and all for less pay. And GM workers especially have borne the brunt of it. Tony talked about, as well as Rebecca, talked about the concessions they've made. For years, they've made concessions all in the name of keeping GM profitable, to keep jobs in the community. That was the mantra. You had to keep GM profitable, otherwise they would leave. So they accepted concessions, limited layoffs, not rollbacks in pay, but no wages increases, not even a cost of living increase since 2007, which blows my mind. Your costs go up, right? Inflation goes up, but you're not getting any more wage increases or even cost of living increases. And to the point where they're forced to accept a two-tiered contract, pitting older workers against younger workers, and getting young workers, removing them from a defined benefit pension plan, forcing them over to a defined contribution pension plan. It's unconscionable. And we know that GM has been crying poor for years. We know that they've said that they need this help, otherwise they will leave. That's why, after the 2008 financial crash, the governments bailed them out for $11 billion. The Ontario and Canadian governments gave them $11 billion. Now, the government refuses to disclose what the actual conditions for that bailout is. They refuse to tell us how much has or hasn't been repaid. But we know that last year, the Trudeau government quietly wrote off a bunch of loans to the auto industry. Some exceed beyond this bailout, and if you look at the history of GM in Canada, it is subsidy after tax credit after handout. We know that we're left on the hook for $3 billion. GM owes us $3 billion, and we know that these auto industry loans, the Trudeau government quietly wrote them off because in 2010, the auto industry just stopped paying them. Could you imagine if you stopped paying your loans? If you went to the bank and said, my mortgage, nah, I'm good. I'm not paying it anymore. What would happen? The bank would repossess your house and take it back. So for years, GM has been telling us they're not profitable. For years, GM has been telling us we need to sacrifice and tighten our belts for the public good. And at the same time, last year, GM made $11 billion in profit. $11 billion in profit, and they announced on their 100th anniversary that they are moving the plants to Mexico and China and moving the jobs there. After a century of blood and sweat and labor that Oshawa and workers have given to the company, they're throwing people out of work. And I want to be incredibly clear that our fight is not with Mexican workers making $6 an hour. It's with the executives and the CEO, Mary Berra, who last year made $29 million in compensation. I don't even know what you do with that much money in 1 year. It's unconscionable and it's immoral, the fact that they make all this money and after 100 years, they throw 15,000 workers off a job and devastate the community in Oshawa. If you ask me, they're lucky we haven't run them out of town with pitchforks. But it's not just the corporation, it's not just GM. Governments have colluded to help them. Governments have been doing their bidding and rigging the rules against workers in favor of the bosses, right? That's why they got the bailout in the first place with such favorable conditions. That's why we wrote off the debt. And that's why we keep doing these things. And the government keeps refusing to talk about nationalization, and it's across the board. It's generations long and a restructuring towards the bosses and away from the workers. Even when we try to play by the rules, the government rigs the game against us. Just look at the postal workers. Before coming onto the Leaf, I was a staffer at the Postal Workers Union. Last year, the postal workers went on strike. They'd gone to court to force Canada Post to pay female and male letter carriers the same. Canada Post said no. After a court ruling, they just denied it and still refused. Canada Post workers, letter carriers and postal workers, are the most injured federal workers. There's an injury crisis, and they refuse to even come to the table and meet. I remember being inside the offices, and they couldn't get any progress because Canada Post refused to meet. And so what did the Postal Workers Union do? They went on strike, but they went on rotating strikes to limit the disruption to the public. And after a couple weeks, what happened? Exactly, Trudeau broke the strike. Despite promising in an election to never, ever, 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 ever do it, they passed back to work legislation to take away the constitutional right to collective bargaining and send postal workers back to work. And that's with the Crown Corporation. So the government and corporations have been rigging the rules against us. And now GM workers, in the face of a crisis, have become courageous and they've become creative. And they've put this solution on the table, in which instead of losing 15,000 jobs, we create 13,000 jobs and we tackle the climate crisis and we create a more livable society. And if you haven't read the study, I really encourage you to do it. It's amazing, it's insightful, and it's got everything in it. I often just want to like roll it up and beat Trudeau over the head with it. Because everything you need is in there. But it would create 13,000 jobs, and in a small investment in 5 years, it would start turning a profit. And it could create Canada Post vehicles, municipal vehicles, all of it. And the feasibility study is quite conservative in its estimates. And in one place, it calls for $1.9 billion investment to purchase the plant and retool it. But only $600 million of that is to actually retool the plant. The rest is to simply buy it from GM. But if GM owes us $3 billion, it's not their plant, it's ours. And it's something we're going to have to fight for and demand. I'm reminded that the state, and like reading history and reading labor history in the country, the state gives no free gifts to the working class. Everything we've gotten, we've had to fight for, whether it's weekends, work protections, or even equal pay or mat leave, we've had to fight for and often go to the line. And I'm reminded of a great quote by the famous labor leader, Michel Chartrand, who said, "The labor movement was born illegal and it grew up illegal." And I would add that if we're going to be successful in defeating inequality and creating the world we want, then we need to be willing to resist and defy unjust legislation. We need to be willing Wouldn't you be willing to resist people who urge calm in the face of a crisis, whether that's a politician, a boss, or a union official? We need to be willing to stand up for what we believe in and to take back what's ours. We need to take the plant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Our final speaker tonight is Fred Hahn, who's president of CUPE Ontario. Please give a round of applause.
Thanks. I want to start by bringing greetings on behalf of our union. We are a public sector union in Ontario. We represent about 270,000 members in every corner of the province, working in literally every kind of part of the broader public sector: municipalities, healthcare, hospitals, long-term care facilities, social service agencies, in universities, and as some of you may have heard over the last couple of days, in every school in the province of Ontario. I just want to say that today, and I was saying this to people earlier, today 55,000 of our members who are support staff in schools, who are secretaries, custodial maintenance workers, early childhood educators, education assistants, speech and language pathologists, people who work in libraries. We have many different job classifications. I put to you that all of those jobs are good green jobs. I put to you that part of the fight for good green jobs should also be supporting our members who are actually fighting to restore services that have been cut from schools. I'm enormously proud of the work that they're doing by beginning this work to rule action, and if any of you want to talk to me more about that, I would be more than happy to do so, and I encourage you to illustrate your support to them, because all of these struggles are connected. I also want to bring greetings on behalf of Tiffany Balducci, who is the Labour Council President in Oshawa and Durham region, but she is also, I'm proud to say, a Vice President of our provincial union, an amazing leader. And it was our members from Oshawa who brought a resolution to our convention last May in CUPE Ontario to debate a resolution that called on us to support the democratic worker control and making public the Oshawa plant, and to say that our union would commit to mobilizing our members up to and including solidarity actions, solidarity walkouts, and political protests in order to achieve this. And I'll say to you that the debate on that resolution was resoundingly positive, because our members see clearly the rationale and the purpose and the importance of this important work that workers in Oshawa have put before us to say, we should take this plant, it is ours, we should make vehicles in Oshawa for our collective future, we can do this, and it takes public sector unions working with private sector unions, working with others in communities to push to do that. Now, some of you might wonder why the heck we would do it. We have tens of thousands of members who live in Durham region. I would say virtually each and every one of them has a story where they are either directly connected today to somebody who works at GM, or in their families. Many of them themselves once worked at GM, as we know in many of these communities, not just in the Durham region, in Windsor and other places. And they're keenly aware of the realities that others have reminded us of, that our tax dollars went to bail out these corporations like GM. They weren't the only ones, because they told us they needed help, because they told us that financial crisis, which by the way many of them were part and parcel of causing, was in fact, my gosh, we have no other option here, we're too big to fail, we need these jobs, you got to invest. And so government came and did what many of us at the time thought was an important thing to do to try to save these jobs. And here we are today with a corporation that is making globally like over 140 billion in profit. It's remarkable to me that we would be in this situation and that people wouldn't be more incensed by it. But it's because we've been poisoned. It's one of the things we talk to our members about. Look, we passed this resolution. I'm proud of the fact that our leaders passed this resolution. I'm proud that it was unanimous. But one of the things that our leaders reminded ourselves of is that our job is to actually go speak to our members about this face to face. Because too many of us aren't sitting in rooms like this. Too many of us are watching the Kardashians and thinking about who should be voted off the island. And we're into the competition that capitalism puts into our heads and poisons us with. And we can't even begin to imagine that this would be possible, and yet it is. And for those who wonder about feasibility studies and data, there is one. And it actually demonstrates enormously clearly why this idea is one that will not only work, but is one that we should demand. But it takes us actually having that conversation with folks in our communities to convince them that this is something that we can mobilize to achieve. It takes reminding people that this is not some wacky idea that some folks in Oshawa came up with, that the German government is actually doing it today, that they are actually doing it today in a way that is not just good for the environment, but profitable. One of the sectors I mentioned in our union was the municipal sector. We go to a conference of municipal employers every year, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, the AMO conference. One of the fascinating things about that conference this year was learning from municipalities that many municipalities have already passed plans to transition their fleets to electric vehicles, because municipalities operate vehicles in a whole bunch of different ways. And they are now trying to figure out where the heck they'd buy these vehicles from. Well, we have an answer for them, right? It could be Oshawa. It could be the plant that we own together that could make these vehicles, not just for Canada Post, for municipalities, for so many parts of the public sector and for others. It's incredibly important for me to say how much I feel honored to be part of this, because I feel like our union is in some ways at the periphery of this fight that others are leading, but we're proud to be part of that fight. We spoke with our members about the LEAP manifesto a couple of years ago, and actually had a concrete debate about adopting that manifesto and about talking to our members internally in our locals about what that means in collective bargaining, what that means for us as a union. We are proud to be part of supporting the Green New Deal initiatives that are operating in various places, and to really be clear about these things, that when people talk about just transition, that just transition can't just be a couple of words that sound good. That just transition has to be clearly defined as good, unionized jobs that have decent wages, that have real pensions, that have real benefits, that have job security built into them, that workers shouldn't have to be just transitioned into a new economy that means that they're making lower wages with less benefits. That has to be clearly defined for all of us. And that in our work with in the labor movement, which is, the labor movement is a very diverse movement in its opinions, and it has many different facets. I would argue that too many of us have been beaten down by years of the globalization, the impact that it's had on our unions, on our members, and that we sometimes aren't able to imagine real possibilities. And the benefit of the Good Green Jobs Initiative in Oshawa is that there are others not just imagining those possibilities, but actually putting forward concrete mechanisms to bring them to light. That is so inspiring. I want to say thank you to you for the inspiration that you're bringing to so many for this work. And it is incredibly important. And this is not something that Canadians don't support. I mean, it's important to understand this, right? That 57% of Canadians just randomly asked, say we're not doing enough to deal with the climate crisis, that 72% of Canadians, 72% of Canadians just randomly polled support a new Green Deal for our country, that 84% of Canadians believe that government vehicles should be transitioned to electric vehicles, and that 67% of Canadians say that we should ban fossil fuel burning vehicles by 2030. The majority of folks are on our side. What we need to do is build the critical mass to bring people behind ideas like this one. And this is a perfect time and an example that we can push for this example, make this a reality, and use this victory as a way to inspire others. So, thanks.